Yeah, with the Kevin Durant trade talks and the Kyrie Irving trade talks not gaining any traction, it's time to showcase just how screwed the Nets really are and why. As we scroll through the list of Brooklyn Nets draft capital on ProSportsTransaction.com, there's going to be a particular year coming up that you guys are going to want to pay attention to. Spoiler warning, it's 2025. Now, in order to explain why the Nets are in trouble in regards to the 2025 draft, you have to go back a couple of years to the initial swap between Houston and Oklahoma City in the Paul for Westbrook deal. Houston gave up a top 4 protected double swap in 2021, a top 4 protected pick in 2024, a top 10 protected swap in 2025, and another top 4 protected pick in 2026. This had the unintentional side effect of forcing Houston to demand a very, very pick-centric return for James Harden. So much so that they even traded many of the players they got back from the Nets for more picks. Jared Allen went to Cleveland for a Milwaukee Bucks pick that was renegotiated later in the PJ Tucker deal to Milwaukee to an unprotected pick this year in 2023. As for the draft capital Brooklyn gave up when acquiring James Harden, they gave Houston every possible unprotected pick and unprotected swap available. Now, the Nets did manage to avoid the behemoth swap in 2021, which had like 6 different teams in there, but it doesn't change the fact that as for 2025, Houston gets to trade the lower of their pick and Oklahoma City's pick for Brooklyn's pick unprotected. Let me pitch you a scenario here. It's the doomsday scenario, but let me pitch you the scenario. Oklahoma City finishes third with the best record in the league for the 30th overall pick. The Nets finish with their pick being number 1 overall. And then Houston finishes somewhere in the middle. They could have their pick land 11th and miss the playoffs. They could have their pick be in the top 10, but they win a couple of playing games to get in the playoffs, putting their pick at 15. Regardless, here's what happens. Oklahoma City takes their pick, executes their swap to move up to Houston's pick. And then Houston takes the pick they now have from Oklahoma City and swaps with the Nets. The realization of this fact is undoubtedly going to affect any return that the Nets get for Durant and Irving. The Nets can say they want all these well-established players now, but that doesn't mean they're going to get them. The complications come in with the stipend rule, which states that you must be guaranteed at least 1 first-round pick over any 2 years. So it's very hard for the Nets to get first-round picks in 23 and 24 from the same team. You need a third team to make. There are only 2 teams who fit this bill off the top of my head. The Oklahoma City Thunder, seen here as I scroll through their draft capital for 2023 and 2024, and the New Orleans Pelicans, seen here. The interesting thing is that the Thunder are more suited to be the third team in a Durant, while the Pelicans are more suited to be the third team in the Irving Westbrook swap that seems imminent, but the Lakers and the Nets are in a standoff. Essentially, for the Thunder, what they could do is, in exchange for trading picks for today, they could get future picks and then maybe get a veteran or 2 to help fill out their young roster. Well, the Pelicans, with their Lakers swap next year and that last Laker pick, could be compensated in such a way with a series of swaps so as to drop the optionality on the last Laker pick and then trade their firsts in 23 and 2024 with minimum protection. And on the off chance one or both of those picks hit, the Nets would just get the initial picks the Lakers were willing to give up in 2027 and 2029. And as a bonus, if you structure this right, the Lakers could free up their own first in 2026 if the compensation going outwards in 2027 is a swap, whether it's an unprotected swap to the Nets or an unprotected double swap to the Pelicans. But really, the easiest way for the Nets to avoid disaster is to finagle another swap on their own pick that they have left in 2025. Because if that swap goes poorly enough for the Nets, it's entirely possible we won't see Brooklyn back in the playoffs until 2030. and that's like 8 years away. I mean, being on the losing end of that swap would be so disheartening for the franchise, particularly since they would still owe another unprotected pick to Houston in 2026. The Nets have either got to get some win now players, which they're aiming for, have got to solve that 2025 swap problem, which is looking less likely because it's entirely possible that the 2025 swap they get has protections on both the top and bottom. If the other team says we won't trade you the swap if our pick lands in the top 4 or your pick, whatever you have left, lands in the bottom 5, I mean, that's better than nothing, but it doesn't quite get the Nets out of the jam that they're in. The best solution is to accumulate draft capital for the next 2 years and try and hit on those picks as much as possible, so that in the event of the worst case scenario, the fan base still has a bunch of young, exciting players to get them through the next 2 years.